I've been doing seasonal park ranger work for the past 8 years, and in that time I've worked in 6 different national parks, mainly in the states of Wyoming, Montana, and Colorado. During peak seasons, I have to work long hours, weekends and nights, you name it, mostly dealing with the public. Boring stuff like answering questions and handing out maps and checking permits. Depending on the park, I do occasionally get called in for search and rescue stuff. I've also been involved in an incident where a bear was wandering around a campground. We tranquilized the bear and tagged it, and that was that. Only once I've seen something really strange while on duty, but it's remained with me because I still haven't been able to explain it. This was the fall of 2016, when I was working on Grand Teton National Park. There had been some unusually heavy rains in the parts of Wyoming the previous week, and 2 of the trails had been closed because of some landslides in those areas. I was out with some more experienced rangers to survey the affected areas and try to figure out how long it might be before we could reopen the trails. We had split up into teams of 2, and I was paired with an older guy who worked year-round in the park. We were going along a rocky overpass that sloped down through some trees to a small meadow in the middle of some hills. And as we made our way through the trees, I noticed that some of them had these huge branches that were curved downwards like hooks. There were maybe 3 or 4 branches like that on different trees. I had never seen it before, so I asked the other ranger what they were. What he said to me was, I wouldn't worry about it. He was a pretty quiet guy, and I thought this was just his way of saying, I don't know. So I didn't push the matter with him. The meadow had slopes all around it, and it was full of wildflowers, a really pretty sight. And we were just moving through it, looking around, when I noticed something about 20 yards away. From where I was, it looked like some boulders, so I just walked over to have a look. My partner kept heading to the other side of the meadow without looking to see what I was doing. As I got closer, I saw that they weren't boulders at all, but seemed to be a group of small stones, all similar shapes, like little cones laid out in 4 or 5 regular rows, kind of like headstones. I knew a little of the history of that place. I knew the place had once been used by the Shoshone, but I hadn't heard of any burial grounds being found in the park. I thought maybe I'd made a big discovery, and I called out to the other ranger. He wasn't more than 40 yards away from me, but if he heard me, he didn't give any sign. He had come to a stop at the edge of the meadow and just seemed to be waiting there, looking off into the distance. I shouted as loud as I could, thinking maybe the guy was a bit hard of hearing, but he stayed where he was and he kept his gaze on the slopes. When I couldn't get his attention, I made my way up to go to the stones and get a closer look, but a really bad feeling came over me then. I felt this powerful sense of dread, like the world had just become a little darker even though it was the middle of the day and sunny. I noticed then it was very quiet around. I couldn't hear birds or insects. Everything just seemed flat and drained of energy. It was really weird. I'm not superstitious, but I heard plenty of stories. And maybe out of some obscure feeling of being respectful, I didn't go any closer to the stones. But I got a good look at them before I went to join my partner. When I got to him and asked if he could hear my shouting, he said that he could. And then he said something that creeped me out. He said, "What did they look like to you?" I told him exactly what I'd seen, and he didn't seem surprised. So I asked if he knew about them already. He told me that he had seen them before, but not here. The other rangers had seen them as well, and a few hikers who had been out in the back country of Teton. Apparently they look different to everyone that's seen them, and you won't find them in the same place twice. I asked him what they looked like to him, and he said bedposts, half buried in the ground. He didn't know what they were though, and he didn't seem to care too much when I asked him about them. After what he said, I kept checking to see if those stones were still there as we went up the slope, which they were. I certainly wasn't expecting them to just disappear, even after what he'd said. I did manage to find that spot a few days later, though, when I went out hiking off duty, and sure enough, I couldn't find a single stone in that meadow. The curved branches in the forest were gone as well. As I said, I'm not superstitious, but the whole thing kind of got under my skin. Enough that I asked a few other rangers if they had seen anything like that before. One or two that I asked had seen something similar. One guy saw fence posts arranged in a pattern in the woods. Another ranger said he came across what looked like blankets half buried on the side of a hill, and said that a ranger he was with at the time told him not to touch them. He'd seen the trees as well, but neither of them had been able to find anything when they went back to that place. I worked at many national parks in my career, chiefly as a backcountry ranger, whereby I'd be out in the trails just about every day, checking to make sure there were no hazards like fallen trees on the trails, occasionally talking to visitors that I'd see hiking or camping out in the wilderness, and making sure they were following the rules of the park. I really just loved being out there though, riding my horse around in those beautiful places. The mountain air and the freedom is amazing. Anyway, I did work at Glacier National Park at one time, and I remember one night I got a serious fright because of something that was in the woods. I was somewhere around Ahern Peak, and I'd camped out the night before in a sheltered spot beneath the mountain. I'd been out in the backcountry for 8 days already, and I was on my way back now so I could fill out my reports and head home to Spokane for a few days. We had made our way back onto the main trail, and the sun was high and there was a light breeze, but otherwise it was a really nice day. Now, the mare I was riding didn't get spooked easily. That's one thing I feel like I should point out right away. She was a sturdy paint horse from a stable down in Columbia Falls, and she was real calm with me after a few years of taking her out there. But she was hostile with other animals, and I'd even seen her attack a cougar while up at Rainbow Peak one time. Well, anyway, we got to a part of the trail where it bent around to the south, and the horse slowed down a lot, and eventually just stopped in the middle of the trail and lowered her head down while she was looking into the woods straight ahead. She was flaring her nostrils and just refused to take another step forward. I looked into the trees with the binoculars, but I couldn't make out anything in there. I had a rifle on my back, but I've always found a good bear spray to be the most effective thing if I come across a grizzly or a black bear out there, and I have my own tricks for making sure it doesn't come to that usually. I had the spray in a holster on my hip, and I was ready to take it out, but I decided the best thing to do was maybe just to go around a longer way. I knew of another trail a mile or two back, the way that would take me a long way around anything that might be up in the trees ahead. So I turned the horse around and headed back, but she was getting pretty difficult to control. She kept snorting and kind of making like she wanted to dash. It was giving me a pretty bumpy ride. I let her go off a bit faster and kept looking back at the trail to see if anything was going to come out. When we reached the other trail, I figured we were pretty much out of danger, but the horse hadn't calmed down, and she gave me a few serious bucks when I tried to slow her down again. We kept going, but the next time I looked back, I could see something coming after us. It was black or maybe dark brown and much bigger than a bear. It was a long way off, but it didn't seem to be running, kind of just trotting on the edge of the tree line, but definitely coming our way. I spurred the horse on and let her go as fast as I dared. Mainly, I didn't want to get into a confrontation with anything, but I figured there wasn't much that could catch us at that speed even if it wanted to. I looked back a few more times and didn't see anything, but the last time I looked back, that's when I saw it. Less than 50 yards back, this big wolf-headed beast crossed over the trail into the forest onto the other side. And it was walking just like you or me would walk, on 2 feet but kind of hunched over as well. It was something out of a nightmare, and I've never seen anything like this. But I only caught the sight of it for a moment before it was gone. I kept the horse going, and when we reached some open plain, we took off at a serious gallop. Every time I looked back, I expected to see something, but I never did again. It took us about 2 hours to get back to the station. I was relieved when we did. Nobody else at Glacier could make much sense of what I told them about that animal I'd seen, and after all this time, neither can I. I've been an avid outdoorsman most of my life, and I hike and camp alone a lot of the time. I generally prefer my own company, and I like to think I know how to handle myself in most of the areas I go to. I have seen and heard some weird stuff out in the wilderness, but I had what I call a bad experience out in Olympic National Park a while back. I had been hiking for 2 days, and on the last planned day of my trip, I had set up my tent on a piece of high ground not too far from Lake Quinault. It was sometime in the summer of 2014. It had rained a ton that day, but in the evening it was nice and sunny. I set up a nice campfire and watched the sun go down. I had already seen 2 bears and a bobcat on my journey through the park. They were at a distance, but I guess I was in a bit of a hyper-vigilant state because I was awake much later than usual that night. It was a couple of hours after the sun went down, and I was still tossing and turning. So I got up and went out of the tent to take a whiz. The sky was clear and the moon and stars were really bright, so I could kind of see the landscape around me, and I could see the shine of the lake through the trees as well. I did my business, and I was just looking around at everything in that cool light. The spot I had chosen to put the tent you could see back down the trail I'd come up earlier that day, and I was looking down the trail when I noticed something black coming towards me. It was a good ways off. It looked like a shadow just walking slowly up the trail, and where the road started to climb up to my spot, it stopped. I don't usually get the heebie-jeebies when I'm out in the forest or up in the mountains by myself, and I've luckily never come across anything too dangerous or felt really threatened by anything out there. But the fact that what looked like a person standing a few hundred yards from me in the dark, just waiting there without a sound, didn't seem right to me at all. Whoever it was didn't have any light gear with them either. It was a bright night, but not bright enough to make it through miles of forest and mountainous terrain without at least a torch. It had taken me maybe 4 hours to get to this spot from anything close to a popular trail. I knew there was a lodge at the other side of the lake, but even that had been empty when I passed by it earlier in the day. I could see the outline clearly because of how light the stones and the path were around it. But the more I looked, the less I liked how big it seemed to be. I was starting to wonder if it was some freakish big bear or something. But the way it had walked, so deliberate and careful with each step, I couldn't get past the idea that it was not another person. And here they were just staring up in my direction. I wasn't sure if they could see me or not, but the longer this moment dragged on, the more unnerved I got. So I just crouched down and crept over to my tent as quiet as I could, and grabbed both my bear spray and my big hunting knife that I've hardly had a cause to use, and which I'd hoped I wouldn't need to use to defend myself now. I went back over to where I'd been looking before, and honestly I got the worst feeling I ever had when I saw this shadowy thing had come much closer while I was in my tent. It wasn't that far off now, maybe 100 yards, and again it was just standing still. I was on all fours just crouching and gripping the knife, watching for the slightest movement from it and afraid to even blink. This went on for what felt like 10 minutes, but I really wasn't sure how much time had passed. The next thing I knew, this thing took off into the trees to its right. It was moving towards the lake, not towards me, which might have been a relief, except that the speed that this thing moved at was absolutely frightening. It was moving through a slope patch of rocky, hilly forest like it was running on a track. When I couldn't see it anymore, I ran into my tent and zipped it down and just clung on to that knife for dear life, thinking to myself that if this thing decides to rush me, I'm dead. And that's something I'm still sure of now. Judging by the size and speed of it, I wouldn't have stood a chance against it, at least not in the dark. I didn't sleep much that night, and thankfully that was my last day at the park. I still camp out in the wild, but I haven't been back to Olympic since. I work in between Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks, and almost, I would say, maybe once or twice a year I hear reports of mysterious lights around somewhere in the park, mainly from tourists. I always take what visitors say with a pinch of salt. They report things like cult symbols carved on rocks, black mountain lions stalking them, and women screaming in the forest, which I always put down to cougars because the females sound like that when they're in heat a lot of the times. When I first started hearing reports of lights flashing and moving around in unusual ways over the mountains, I thought, here we go with the amateur UFO hunters trying to stir things up again. And I was like, why can't people just enjoy the outdoors without dreaming up crazy things to waste my time with? But the more time I spent in Sequoia in particular, the more I started noticing things going on as well, to the point that I started telling other rangers about it. And I found out that a few of them had seen them too. The first time really wasn't that exceptional. I was leading a tour on one of the popular trails, and one of them pointed out a bright white light in the sky close to the watchtower, about 5 clicks from where we were standing. It just hung there for a few minutes. Everyone was asking what it might be, and I said it was probably a drone of some sort hitting the sun just the right way to make it shine. As we moved on, the light started to zigzag downwards in the sky, and then it just kind of went out of existence, and there was nothing left to be seen. Now this was very odd, but I saw something like it again about a half a year later, except this time it was in the middle of the forest. I was just checking out one of the trails, and I was close to Morro Rock Trail, and I noticed another bright light further off through the trees. The light was very bright in the woods, and I could see it even around the tree trunks as I got closer to it. What was funny about that time was that there was a low but very piercing screeching sound that seemed to be reverberating through the trees, not coming from the direction of the light, but it seemed to be all around me, and I couldn't hear any normal forest sounds while it was going on. I thought it must just be my ears ringing, maybe with a change in elevation. I got within 100 yards of this thing and it just vanished again. But the noise didn't go away immediately. It kind of just faded away until I couldn't hear it anymore. I saw lights like that a few more times over the years, but the last time was around 6 months ago. It was definitely the strangest. I was working one evening in the spring and I was coming back by the river valley. And again I saw a light, but there was more than one this time, sitting just above and beyond some trees beyond a narrow creek. They were much closer than I'd seen them before this time, but I couldn't seem to focus my eyes on them. And again, the sun was still bright, but the glare from these lights almost burnt my eyes. I found it almost hard to look at them, as if I was staring right into the sun. There seemed to be about 7 or 8 of them in a pattern, where they were all in equal distance from each other. There was no noise at this time at first, but before I could think about anything, my ears were filled with the most awful screeching. It was a really grating, high-pitched sound that made me clamp my palms against my ears, but that did nothing to keep the sound out. I turned and ran away out of instinct, and after a few dozen steps, the noise faded down again, and it was gone. I turned around and the lights were still there as bright as ever, and then they disappeared again just like they did before. I haven't managed to capture these things on video yet, but I have seen some footage online from people who have been to Sequoia that looks like what I saw, although the video doesn't really do it justice to what these things look like in real life. When I worked up at the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, I used to hear about an old Cherokee legend, about a woods witch that would snatch children away and eat their body parts. Thankfully, there were never any missing children cases while I was out there. A good many missing hikers, though, for sure, but most of them turned up eventually. Usually it was just people misjudging the terrain or the conditions, or tragically going out there with the intention of not coming back. While I was there, I was based out of Gatlinburg, which is a small town not too far from one of the entrances. But this one time I remember I was working up at the old Sugarlands Trail because some trees had come down on the trail with bad weather, and I was just out there trying to clear the trail. I had just started working to clear the trail when I saw something down through the trees, about 50 or 75 yards down the path, down this little slope in some pretty thick forest. I could see it really well because it was fall, and it really stood out against the color of the trees. It had very dark black fur. I thought it was a black bear, but I was pretty curious, so I just continued watching this animal, and when it came to a stop, I decided to come to a stop as well, because I didn't want to spook it. I wanted to get a better look. The more I looked, though, the more I saw. This thing was hidden among the trees, but I could see that it had very long back legs that were bent backwards the same as a dog. Its hind quarters were kind of slim but rose into this great broad back with a hump in it that almost reminded me of a bison. It looked like it was looking up at me from the side, but as I moved my head around to see, I caught sight of its head. And that's when I started to think that maybe I was a bit too close to whatever this thing was. But before I could turn and run, it came charging up the hill at me, and I just stood there. I'd like to say I was bravely standing my ground, but it was some kind of primal fear that rooted me to the ground in that moment. I don't know whether it was instinct or what, but I stood there anyway. And it came towards me between the trees. I caught sight of those big slobbering jowls like a Rottweiler has, and these two eyes that were black under the trees but had a streak of yellow in them as well. It kept coming up the hill on the trail, and then about 30 yards away from me, it darts off into the forest. I couldn't believe what I had just seen. I decided the best thing to do was to head back to the visitor center and make sure these trails stayed closed until we got some animal experts in here to find out what in the hell is running around out here. In the end, though, we couldn't find any trace of an animal that wasn't supposed to be in the park, and the matter got dropped after about a week where myself and some other rangers did a lot of tracking and searching around there. Nothing ever turned up. Being a park ranger means getting to share with people what a special and unique place you work in. There's a saying among park rangers that we get paid in sunsets. But for me, getting to watch deer and bear outside my office is another perk. And actively getting to protect what's best about America, its natural heritage. I'm part Shoshone as well, so I feel like I have a strong connection to the land. So it really gets me going when I have to deal with people abusing the rules of the park, which are there to protect the place and its wildlife. One night, I was called out to something strange though, which reminded me that nature has a way of defending itself. I was called out with several other rangers to Teton Park Road in the middle of January 2012. That road is closed from November to May, so when another ranger came across the trails of an animal out there, as well as tracks that led from the road out into the plain, we all knew we were dealing with an illegal hunting situation. Best I could guess is they shot a bison while it was crossing the road, then probably loaded it onto a truck in the cargo bed and then took off with their prize. They made a real mess of the bison while they were loading it by the looks of things, and the blood was real fresh, so we thought we had a good chance of catching up with them, especially with an animal in the back of the truck. We split into groups of 2 or 3 and headed out. We were only about a mile into the hills, still following pretty clean tracks when we saw the truck up ahead, and it was stopped. We approached carefully. Every one of us was armed and ready for trouble if it came our way. When we got close, I could see the dead bison in the bed, and I could see that the passenger door of the truck was wide open. We came around real careful to see who might be inside, but there was no sign of anyone in there. I had to look around the inside. The weapon they used to kill the bison was propped up behind the seat on the driver's side. One of the other rangers was shining his flashlight into the hills when he whistled at us and then hollered for us to come over. I had my flashlight in the car, but I could see well enough what he was pointing out with his own. There was a woman wandering around only 50 yards away. We called out to her, that we were law enforcement, but we got no reply. I could see that she wasn't armed, but two of the rangers approached her with their weapons drawn, insisting that she go to the ground. She was a middle-aged woman, tall and slim. When she finally saw us, she didn't seem to know what was going on or why we were there. I wondered if maybe she was on drugs because she kept mumbling something underneath her breath and looking over her shoulder. But I was thinking that getting that bison up there by herself while high would be a pretty tall order. Well, after we had searched the area for anyone else, we brought this lady back to our ranger station, as we wanted to see if we could find out what had happened out there. After about an hour, she started coming around some. She was like coming out of some type of daze. She confessed to taking the bison down, but she said it was her boyfriend who had done the shooting as well as the driving. She had helped him with the loading, and when the two of them were driving back with their prize, they heard this real high-pitched ringing in their ears. The next thing she remembered was being paralyzed from head to toe. She couldn't even move her eyes. She was just sitting there frozen. The truck had come to a stop. Her boyfriend wasn't moving beside her. In the glare of the headlights, she saw a man walk up to the driver's side, and then she could hear him doing something to her boyfriend. When she was able to move again, the boyfriend was gone, and she didn't know where she was or how she had got there, which was when we found her. Now, a few days later, our friend down at the sheriff's office told us that the lady tested negative for any intoxicants or drugs. And the truck had been her boyfriend's, and he was missing. And who do you think ended up having to go search for this guy? Of course it was us, out there searching for him. With the snow that winter, though, it was like looking for a needle in a haystack. My best guess was that he had run off and the girl was covering for him. But I heard that after she paid her fines for everything she got cited for that evening, I heard that she went out to look for the boyfriend in the hills off Teton Road with some of his family. I don't work up there anymore, but I don't know if they ever did find that man. I worked for Glacier Park for many years in the 90s, and I was in charge of a station where I'd mostly do midday to evening shifts. One evening in the summer months, I was up at the station doing some paperwork when a man knocked on my door. So I went outside and we talked for a while. He was a younger man and he had his dog with him. He wanted to know about spots to hunt game up there. Told me he was planning to come back and maybe bag a buck with some friends if he could. It was while I was talking to him that the dog started getting really aggressive. I thought it was going for me at first by the way it was pulling on the leash, and it was barking its head off. I looked at the man and he was looking behind me, and his face had gone pale as snow. I pretty much knew what I was going to see when I turned around, so I told him to pick up his dog and slowly move away towards his car. Don't shout or make any sudden movements or make eye contact with it. I slowly turned around to face it. There were often black bears outside my office up there. They'd come by at least once a week that time of year, but I never had any trouble with them. I caught a glance of a big dark thing standing on two legs in the trees behind the station, but my head snapped around again because this man had just taken off with his dog under his arm, sprinting as hard as he could towards his car. I had the bear spray out, and in a second I turned to face it, but there was nothing there when I turned. My heart sank when I turned back around and saw that it was following the line of the trees in the direction of this man's car, and it was without a doubt going to get there first. But when I got to the edge of the tree line, it stopped dead in its tracks and then just stood there, as the man opened the back seat of his car and went in with him and his dog. I watched him scramble his way into the front seat and start up the engine. I don't know if he could see what was watching him through his mirror, but he just had a one-track mind and wanted to get his dog and him in the car and out of there as quickly as he could. I had made my way back to the door of the station because I could see why that thing had scared him so much. It didn't look like any bear. It was some kind of misshapen beast that I'd never seen before, and wouldn't be too keen on seeing again. The way that thing ran on all fours and then stood up on two legs and then watch the man leave was scary enough. But its head was truly formidable from what I could see. A very long snout with these big nasty teeth that just hung over the side of its mouth. A very ugly creased face like a dog that had been beaten by its owner. Whatever it was went down the road the car had gone, but slowly, not chasing it, just walking after it, this time on all four legs. I don't know what this thing was, but I never saw anything like it again after that. In all the parks that I worked at, nothing really compared to the stars on a clear night out at Black Canyon of the Gunnison in Colorado. The reason for it being so good down there is thanks in no small part to the Park Service, because we work with the International Dark Sky Association to keep it that way, making sure to educate the public and keep the light pollution to an absolute minimum. In 2017, I was working a lot of nights during the summer, when you can see the Milky Way rising up early in the evening until a few hours later it's right overhead. Truly a magical sight. One evening during that summer, I was working up near Kneeling Camel Overlook. I had given some guided stargazing tours earlier in the evening, and I was just out by myself heading up this road towards the old ranger station, when I heard something shouting towards my direction. When I got there, there was a young girl in a hat shouting out the name Michael with her hands cupped around her mouth. She had a headlamp on that kind of blinded me when I came down to see her and to see what was going on. Her name was Anna, and she told me that she had been over at a viewpoint with her boyfriend, this Michael, and they had been looking up at the stars through their telescope. Michael had spotted something in the sky but didn't know what it was. He asked her to take a look. Anna put her eye to the telescope but couldn't see what he was talking about when she had looked back to him and Michael was gone. At first, she thought that maybe he was just trying to scare her, but that wasn't like him, she said. This was over an hour ago. She stayed at the viewpoint for a while thinking he'd come back, but when he didn't, she wandered around looking for him, eventually coming back to where they had parked their car. We went back to the viewpoint, went all over the rocks and down the trail and up to the overlook, but couldn't find any sign of this Michael. We looked for about an hour ourselves, but I knew that because of the fall risk, I was probably going to have to call it in, even though there wouldn't be much we could do until it got light out. I got into my car and Anna joined me. Since Michael had had the keys to their car, I needed to get to the north rim so I could get back up and make some calls. We had gone just less than a mile down the road when there was Michael right in front of us, just walking along and minding his own business. Anna got out of the car and chewed him out right then and there, but the young man was confused. According to him, Anna was the one who had gone missing. He told us that he had been looking up at the sky, and then he looked back at Anna and she wasn't there. He had tried to go back to the car, but he couldn't remember the way, even though it was a clear path to it from the viewpoint they had been at. He had got lost and he was trying to follow the road to where he thought he parked the car. Also, he told us that he heard Anna screaming his name, but every time he would go towards it, the sound would come from a different direction. The strangest part of this story was that according to him, all of this had happened in the last 20 minutes. He was at a loss for words when we told him that more than 2 hours had passed since he went missing. They seemed like they were completely sober to me, just very stressed and now relieved to have found each other again. As far as I was concerned, all was well that ended well, and I dropped them back to their car and saw them off. This is by far the weirdest encounter that I've had working there. During my time as a forest ranger, I worked in many national forests, and one time I was working near Lincoln County in Maine that I had two experiences that permanently changed the way I look at those forests from that point on. I was out on an overcast day at the start of fall. This was back in 2016, and I was doing some biological survey work pretty deep into the woods. I had walked in from a road that was maybe 20 minutes into the forest when I came across this house in a clearing right in the middle of some pretty thick woods. There didn't seem to be any trail or driveway leading up to it. It was just there by itself, an old-fashioned wood cottage, not very big, with a little shed out back. I pulled out the map that I had with me because I hadn't remembered seeing any properties listed in this area when I was looking at it beforehand. There wasn't much cell reception that deep into the woods, but my GPS receiver told me I was roughly where I thought I was. And looking at the map again, there definitely wasn't supposed to be a house there. It looked old and abandoned, but I could see that it still had a front door which was open. I called out just on the off chance that there was anyone inside, maybe a squatter or some teenagers. When I got no reply, I walked up to the door and popped my head inside. It was run down and decrepit. I could see an old stove, a table, and some chairs. There were no curtains and only a window, which faced out to the front, and some pieces of junk like empty cans and cups and plates. I thought maybe it was some seasonal lodge for a hunter in the area, but it looked like it hadn't been visited in a very long time. I stepped inside the house to take a little look around, but I had just come into the door when I got this weird feeling, because I saw something out of the corner of my eye outside of the window, which when I looked turned out to be someone standing near the trees on the other side of the clearing in front of the house. Whoever it was, they were standing there with their back to the house so I couldn't see their face. It looked like a heavy-set man wearing blue overalls. He had a brown shirt underneath and this grayish-green cap on. I immediately went to the front door to call for him, thinking maybe this was his house, but when I got to the door and looked out, he was gone. Not gone exactly. He was in the trees now, but much further away, and he was walking away from the house. I still don't know how he got so far away so quickly, but at the time I just jumped down and sprinted off after him. But I remember getting a really bad feeling as I stepped into that clearing again. I don't know what it was, just a sense of something being off or wrong. I couldn't hear any of the usual forest sounds, and I got this chill up my spine. I kept going all the same, but I couldn't catch up with this guy. He was already so far ahead of me, and even though he looked to be walking, I just couldn't seem to get closer to him. So I stopped chasing after him. I didn't like the idea of running through the forest after someone I didn't know. I could see the man in the distance still walking, but I wasn't going to chase him anymore. I turned back towards the house, but it was then I realized I was actually lost. I'd gone beyond the site of the house. I had a little difficulty getting back to some familiar landmarks. The thing that I found most strange about this whole thing was that when I tried to find that house again, and I looked for it a lot of times, always following the GPS and maps, but I never came across it again. I've worked within the National Park Service for more than 21 years, and in that time I've worked in almost all the major national and state parks of Alaska. I can remember a handful of weird happenings from nearly all of them, but it was when I was working at Wrangle Saint Elias 13 years ago now that I saw something that I still think about quite often. I was driving back from Rufus Creek campsite trying to get back to the ranger station before it got dark, but it was a while since I'd been up that way, and I was also enjoying some of the mountain views from the road. It was when I was driving through a part that has forest on both sides, and then comes out on top of a hill where you can see for miles into a wooded valley below. And I caught sight of this black dot going across the hills, but heading in my general direction. I had a clear view, and I kept an eye on it for about a half a mile, and then decided to pull the car over and take a look with the binoculars. I lost sight of it behind a hill momentarily, but when it crested the hill and came down on the other side, I looked and saw what appeared to my eyes to be this giant black dog, very hairy at the neck and shoulders. It was running very fast through the wooded hills. It seemed to be heading towards a creek that I knew was about 2 miles back the way I had came. The road crossed over a part of it, giving a good view of the entire creek. I knew I was going to lose sight of that dog thing soon, So I watched it as long as I could, and then I jumped back in my car. I drove faster than I probably should have, but there was no one else on the road that day, and I've never seen anything like this before. I had to get another look at it. And the whole time I drove, I was just hoping that I would be there in time, and that it wasn't going to go off into a completely different direction. When I got to the bridge that crossed the creek, I got out and looked through the binoculars again. I couldn't see anything at first, and it looked like I had missed my opportunity, but then I saw something black moving into the trees at the far end of the creek. And sure enough, there it was, heading back off towards the hills. I had a much better view of it this time, and to be honest, I was a little bit scared by what I could see. This thing had a really wide mouth with these grisly front canines. It didn't see me, but it was moving around the rocks near the water, and I could see this fearsome orange eyes that were really deeply set in its face, which was canine for sure, but it looked squashed and creased, giving me the impression of something like a giant bat. It was truly a terrifying creature, and I was glad that I had my distance from it. After a couple minutes, I finally lost sight of it through the trees. That was the last time I saw anything like that at Wrangle. Having said that, I've spoken to some other rangers in Alaska about it, and apparently things like that have been seen on some of the preserves up there over the years. I know there are native legends about these things, but I really don't know what to think about this. I was working as a park ranger for the United States Forest Service in the summer of 2007 at Mendocino National Forest in Northern California. The campground was situated within the redwoods, with little cabins sprinkled all over. These were often rented to tourists and travelers. The campground was usually not very full, and we had plenty of time to keep it clean. One late afternoon, I was driving around the campground to gather up any trash before the coming weekend. I had to make several stops at different sites to empty the trash into large barrels. Everything went smoothly as I rode along, until of course the last cabin. The sun was setting, and the tree cover made it darker than it really was. As I readied myself to lift the trash bin into the barrel, I felt like there was someone inside the cabin peering out one of the windows. The cabin was empty during this time of year, as we used it a lot more during the off-season for winter and ski tourists. It was by far the largest. I squinted at the window while placing the garbage back on the ground. I was stunned to see this person, an older gentleman, turning his head back and forth as if he were looking around for something outside of the cabin. At first, I decided to stop and see if this person was lost or needed any help. I walked slowly up to his window, but noticed that he seemed to back up into the darkness inside. I was becoming concerned that this was more of a break-in situation. I got close and peered inside, but I didn't see anyone in there, even as I tried to use whatever outside light I could to make out anything in the room. Whoever it was must have ducked down, I thought. There was no movement, and it was as if this person just disappeared. Against my better judgment, I knocked on the window and asked if he needed any assistance, but I received no response. Not even a footstep. And I thought to myself, there's no way I'm imagining this, am I? And now I was becoming more concerned that he was a threat. I pulled out my radio as I headed back towards my truck. There was no one on the other line, even though there were 2 other rangers out there. I looked up from my radio, and there, standing in front of my truck, with a double-barreled shotgun in hand, was the same old man from the window. Every hair on my body stood up straight. Where had he come from? I would have heard him walk by. This strange old man began chasing me back towards the cabin. I heard shots fired, but there was nothing getting hit. No splinters off trees or holes in the cabin wall. I got to the front door of the cabin and tried the knob, but it was locked. I turned in a panic, assuming I was done for, and there was no one there. This old man disappeared. I got into my truck and immediately drove off as fast as possible, not wanting to anger that old man again. My supervisor later told me about an old hermit that used to live in the cabin years ago, back before we even built our campground and restored all the original buildings. He said that people believed that if you happened to disturb this hermit unexpectedly, you would be stuck with 7 years of bad luck. Zion National Park is 85% wilderness, and I had the pleasure of looking after a small part of that wilderness while I was in my first year as a qualified park ranger. I had done some summer work down there while I was a sophomore in college, and I loved the place even more when I was living there full time. I was living in a small RV down at Angel's Landing, not the most luxurious of accommodations, but it was made up for by the amazing views of the canyons right outside my window. It had amazing sunsets and sunrises. The nighttime down there is pretty amazing as well. It's so dark that you can really appreciate the night skies full of stars. There was one night that myself and another rookie ranger had been up pretty late talking and having a few drinks. We were checking out the stars and just enjoying the start of a few days off, where we planned to do some hiking around some of the more remote areas of the park. It was the start of summer, and we were staying up for the early sunrise. It was probably about 3 in the morning, with the two of us sitting outside our RVs, just talking away. We both heard this low growling sound that became louder as we listened. It was coming from the other side of the road, which was about 100 yards away from us. We looked at each other with these confused looks on our faces, as we couldn't figure out what could be making that noise. It stopped for maybe 30 seconds, and then it started again, this time louder than it was before. Whatever it was sounded like it was getting closer to us, and I remember thinking that whatever it was must have been pretty big because of how loud the sound became when it got closer and closer. I asked my friend if he thought it could be a bear, and he shook his head like he didn't know. There are black bear in this area, it just didn't sound like one. We sat there trying to figure out what could possibly be making these sounds when all of a sudden 2 deer came running across the road right in front of us past my RV. You could tell that they were spooked by whatever made those noises just a few moments earlier. The thing that struck me most about this situation, though, wasn't the fact that these 2 deer had just jetted across the road in front of my RV. Instead, it was I noticed these bright orange eyes looking back at us from behind some bushes about 50 yards away. As I stood there and stared at it, I could see the outline of this creature that stood up on its hind legs and walked through these small trees until you could barely see its head peeking over top of them. I estimated its height around 7 or 8 feet tall based on how high its head was compared to the tree stumps next to where I saw it standing. My friend and I both stared at each other with these shocked expressions on our faces, not knowing exactly what we had just seen. So we just sat there quietly for a few moments trying to process what had just happened. After about a minute of silence, I turned to my friend and said, "Did you just see that?" He said, I don't know if that's a bear or not." We both agreed that bears don't stand that tall on their hind legs, and they certainly don't have bright orange eyes like that. Even though I was planning for a few days off, this thing made me reconsider doing a hike in the more remote areas of the park. I decided to call into the ranger station the next morning to see if they had heard of any large animals in the area. They said that there was a black bear around, but nothing much bigger than that. I told them what we saw, and they were pretty surprised. Whatever it was, though, it seemed to be quite curious about us. So maybe it would have come over to check us out if we had stayed out any longer. Either way, seeing something like that made my time working at Zion National Park all the more memorable. I was camping down in Yosemite one time in 2018. It's a really nice place, and I'd been there several times before. I was living in Sacramento, and back then, I had made the trip down with my girlfriend at the time. We were into our 3rd day of a 5-day camp and hike out in the backcountry of the northern part of the park. I'm pretty experienced in the outdoors, but this was her first time on an extended stay in the wild. On the 3rd day, we were about a mile from a place that I figured from the map must have been Mule Pass. pretty rocky, mountainous terrain, and very hard to hike after our previous 2 days. We settled down to have some lunch on this rock that we could see pretty far around us. We were sitting on these rocks and eating when I saw some smoke off in the distance, up to the northeast where the ground rose up into rocky hills and ridges. I took out the binoculars and saw that there was a fire at the foot of one of those hills, giving off a thick black and gray smoke. It seemed very strange to me because the land out there was nothing but rocks and grasses. A few trees here and there in patches, but definitely not a place I expect to see wildfires. We decided to go over there, and when we got to the foot of the hill, we found a very deliberately lit fire with a very bad smell coming out of it, like rotting flesh on fire. It was about the size of a big campfire, but it was burning wood that had been laid out in a perfect structure by somebody. And on the top of the wood, there was a headless carcass of a deer. I didn't like what I was seeing here one bit, and my girlfriend wanted to get out of there. So we made our way back the way we had come, looking out for any signs of people in the area. We lost sight of the fire as we walked to the southeast, and eventually got onto a trail that went across the mountains. We walked for about 4 or 5 miles, and then we got to a bend in the trail where there was a tree just standing off the path. We were right on top of it before we noticed what was wrong there. Sitting in the middle of the tree, wedged sideways, there was an antlered head of a deer. It was dripping blood all down the trunk and onto the ground below, as it had just been cut off. My girlfriend screamed when she saw it, and to be honest, that was enough for me as well. We beelined it east towards the nearest road after that. It was a long way, and it took most of the rest of the day. But we got there by evening after hours of walking and looking back over our shoulders. I don't know what was going on down there that day, but I absolutely have no desire to set foot in that part of Yosemite again. In the spring of 2015, I was living in Brecksville, working at Cuyahoga Valley National Park in Ohio. I was leading a group of 6 older hikers up from the Boston Mill Visitor Center and headed towards the Blue Hen Falls. I remember that the parking lot around the falls was closed because there was construction going on up that year, and we didn't see anyone else on the Buckeye Trail for at least a couple miles. When we were getting close to the falls, though, we met a very anxious-looking pair of hikers, a young man and a woman, who said that they had seen a big, nasty-looking creature that sounded like a bear when they described it. And they told us it was up along the trail in the trees. They advised us not to go up there. Personally, I've never seen any of the black bears that apparently turned up at Cuyahoga every now and then. And I had certainly never heard of them being spotted around here this early in the year. But I took their word for it and advised the group that it could be dangerous to keep going. I guess they felt strength in numbers because all they wanted to do was go up and catch a sight of the bear if they could. A couple of them had bear spray, and they didn't seem to be afraid of a bear encounter. I felt like I should have probably told them outright that they should turn back, given that some of these folks were well past 60. But I thought it would probably be okay to keep going. They agreed to do exactly what I said if we spotted the animal, and so we moved on towards the falls. We made it all the way there without seeing anything, but it was on the way back that I actually did see something in the trees. I was a little ways ahead of the group, and I was just glancing into the forest to the right of the path when I saw something in a tree about 30 yards in. It was like some kind of black hairy ape, the way it was sitting kind of perched on this big branch in the middle of a tree, with one really long, thick arm holding onto the trunk. I could make out its head as well, but that didn't look ape-like, more like a wolf's head on an ape's body. But something very strange about its eyes and snout that made it seem very disfigured. And it was just sitting there watching us from the dark of the forest. I took all of this in within a few seconds, and my instinct was just to keep on walking, keeping my eyes straight ahead so as not to make any direct eye contact, but keeping it in my peripheral vision the whole time. I didn't want to alert the group and have them stop and start causing a big fuss, especially because I didn't know what in the world I had just seen. I kept my eyes on the path, but I was very aware of that thing watching me the whole way until we got to a bend in the path that led away from those trees. Without saying anything, I slid to the back of the group. Luckily, none of them had seen anything, or I don't know what might have happened. I looked back a few times just to make sure nothing was coming after us. And it wasn't until we crossed the Boston Mill Road that I felt like I could breathe half easily again. As far as I know, nothing like this has been seen down there since, but I have told other rangers to keep an eye out when I hear they're working in that part of the park. I had a very strange experience in May of 2017 while hiking with my 2 teenage daughters at Mount Baldy in California. We got there almost at noon to avoid the tourist rush from the nearby resort. We opted to stay on a more traditional path away from all that. I took the lead and my daughters remained side by side behind me. I stayed the course on our map and we got a great few photos and tons of exercise. It was late afternoon by the time we had reached the point of turning around, and I knew my wife would freak out if we were out there in the dark. I began to regret getting there so much later in the day. We began heading down the mountain the same way that we came, sticking to the pass. There were no other stragglers along the way, which kind of worried me, but I didn't want to alarm the girls. Twilight became our light as we reached the bottom of the mountain. I took my phone out to see if I could even text my wife, but I didn't have any service. I knew she was going to kill me. We still had about a mile through some woods to get there where we parked. I turned around and made sure my daughters made it down safely. Behind them, I saw what appeared to be a young girl, about 10 years old, walking down the hill. She was wearing this light-colored dress and had long blonde hair. She was several feet behind my girls already, and she was walking extremely fast. When she got behind one of my daughters, I could see that there was this trail of dead leaves as she walked. The leaves were in a straight line behind her, kind of like floating in thin air. I noticed she had a blank expression on her face, and she looked directly at me, but she couldn't seem to see me. She proceeded to walk right through my daughter, who had no idea what was coming. She shrieked and shuddered, her sister luckily grabbing onto her as they both now saw what I saw. I yelled out to them, telling them to run towards the car. They were just as scared as I was because they seemed frozen as the girl kept walking forward. Luckily, they snapped out of it and began running. They tried to stop near me to pull me along, but I just told them to keep running. This eerie child was not going to stop coming, and I felt this sense of danger. Once she got closer to me, I was prepared to run with them, but suddenly she disappeared from my view. Just the leaves remained suspended in the air. I didn't want to take any chances, so I took off running towards the car with the girls. I heard an extremely loud crackling sound coming from directly behind me, but I didn't want to look. The sound was so loud and frightening that it reminded me of a stampede. I could see in the distance the light from the parking lot as the light overhead was fading. I decided to turn around and look before finally making it to the car. The noise stopped abruptly and I saw nothing but trees and brush. It was quiet again. We left right away without saying a word to each other about what had just happened on our way home. And we didn't tell my wife. It wasn't until later that my daughters told me they Googled the area and they found out that a girl had been missing there from a nearby town. She was pictured in a blue dress. I've never experienced anything like that before or since, and we never spoke about it again until now. I've been a park ranger at Crater Lake National Park in Oregon for 16 years. I've seen and heard many strange things in all that time, but one incident really sticks out in my mind. It happened in the fall of 2009. It involved an older father, a son, and a daughter-in-law who were taking a small family vacation. They were staying at one of our campsites at Lost Creek Campground with their dog. As it was told to me, the daughter-in-law was sitting outside of her tent, about 9 p.m. on their last night, when she noticed this movement from about 20 or 30 feet away. She assumed it was a park ranger checking in on them since they were staying in a designated site. She called out towards the movement, but she got no response. She thought it was strange, but didn't sense any danger, so she began to stand up, ready to move in that direction. Then their dog, a shepherd, began growling at whatever was moving. Before she could figure out what was happening between the movement and the noise, her husband called her back into the tent for a moment to ask her a question. She lost track of what she was doing and just retreated into the tent for a few minutes to tend to whatever. When she came back outside, everything was still just for a moment until the same movement began again. This time it was much closer, about 10 feet away. The dog began to bark its head off and pull at its lead that was secured to a tree trunk. The shadow of whatever was approaching was like a large bear. Being used to camping, she didn't think it was a bear at all, but she couldn't understand the size of whatever it was coming towards her. Freaking out was all she could do, and the dog alerted her husband and father-in-law to the scene. When they got to her, there was nothing moving and no one crawling towards her. It completely vanished. The next morning, they were packing up to leave, and the father-in-law kept insisting she might have been dreaming. She insisted back that she wasn't, explaining to them how she felt like they were still being watched as they loaded their car. I was on my way up to do my first set of rounds, and I checked in on them as part of my job. The men said all was well when I asked, but the woman began to tell me what had happened to her the night before. I told her that there was a lot of stories about people or demons or other occult things, but never a bear. I chuckled a bit, I admit. I never even had anyone give me a Bigfoot story. She was adamant that this bear was watching them all night and that it was watching them leave right at that moment. I looked around the site and everything was still. The two men laughed and told her to get into the car. As they drove off, I waved my ranger hat at them. But before I could get it back onto my head, what sounded like the growling of a bear was coming from behind me. I slowly turned around to see nothing, but the growling still continued right in front of me. It was as if this bear was standing 5 feet in front of me. I turned around and hightailed it to my car and got out of there. It was by far the strangest thing that ever happened to me while I was a park ranger out there. I was hiking on a trail in the Green River State Park in Utah. It was early summer 2008, and I was doing my usual Sunday routine. I would grab some breakfast and head out for a hike by myself to get some outdoor exercise before my week began. I was alone most of the day because the weather had not been cooperating for that time of year, and I was at least 6 miles from the trailhead, hiking through some heavy timber and thick underbrush. I was preparing myself to return when I heard it. At first, it sounded like a child screaming far off in the distance, but as I listened closely, it didn't sound human at all. The scream only lasted a few seconds, then it stopped abruptly. It sounded like whatever made the noise either choked or stopped suddenly. The hair stood up on my arms and neck immediately. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Whatever made this noise was definitely dangerous, even deadly. My immediate thought was that it might be a bear or a mountain lion. Whatever it was sounded dangerous, that's all I really knew. My fear turned into curiosity as to what exactly could have made such a terrifying noise, especially since it didn't happen again. There were no rock outcroppings or caves nearby where something could hide, so whatever made that sound had to be right there with me. After listening carefully for several minutes without hearing anything further, my curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to move further down the trail to discover whatever kind of animal, if indeed it was an animal, could make such a sound. As quietly as possible, I began moving deeper into the brush, hoping to get close enough to identify whatever it was before it identified me. After about 10 minutes after hearing the first scream, while trying desperately not to make any unnecessary noises, another shrill scream came from directly ahead of me. Again, whatever made that noise seemed to choke off its scream quickly. I decided once again to move towards it. Within just a few short steps, another blood-curdling scream came from right beside me. Whatever this thing is, it is screaming right next to me, as if it were leaning into my ear. I was stunned at first, and my right eardrum rang, but I shook my head. I instantly panicked and began to fumble back towards the direction of my car, which was miles away. I got 2 miles before I turned to check, but there was no sign of anything following me. Of course, every shadow had me second-guessing myself. I continued with the jog, using whatever adrenaline was left to get away from whatever made that shriek in my ear. I could see the area where my car was parked when it began to rain heavily. I was completely soaked, so I huddled up on my legs for a moment, trying to catch my breath. The sense of dread felt 6 miles up the road was in me again. I slowly stood up straight and turned, and within 5 feet of me was a small child, soaking in the rain with twigs in her brown hair and rings around her eyes. She was in rags. Before I could reach out to her, thinking she needed my help, she screamed that same scream at me, almost completely taking out my hearing altogether. She choked on the end of the scream and then disappeared. I looked around everywhere and saw nothing. I booked it to my car and got in drenched. I started hiking in other areas after that. It was a beautiful night in late spring of 2015. Friends of mine from high school all decided to meet at a campground in Devil's Lake State Park, near where we grew up in Baraboo, Wisconsin. There were mild temperatures and clear skies. A few of us were just sitting around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling ghost stories, when I happened to glance up and see something out of the corner of my eye. I was beginning to think the stories were getting to me. But there, standing on the other side of the field, was this huge black shadow. It had no face or form that I could make out except for its dark silhouette. I immediately thought it must be a bear. But bears don't usually stand upright like that. Everyone stopped talking and stared as they also took notice. I wasn't crazy after all. This shadow just stood there watching us. After what seemed like an eternity, it turned around and started walking away from us into the trees beyond where we could see it anymore. It was only then when I realized how terrified we were that we had just seen this thing. Everyone began to panic, saying things like, "Let's get out of here now. We need to tell somebody about this." I tried to calm everybody down by saying that whatever it was probably gone by now, so there was no point in getting ourselves all worked up over nothing. Everyone eventually did calm down enough and began coming up with ideas about what it logically could have been. They finished roasting their marshmallows and went back inside their tents for the night, but I stayed outside for a moment to make sure the fire was out. It was then that I saw it again. The shadow was hanging over one of my friend's tents. He was inside the tent alone, and I didn't know if he knew that that thing was over him. I wanted to call out to him, but something stopped me. I couldn't speak as the shadow began to disappear again. Then wind flew by me from behind, and I turned to see the shadow again, almost perched like a gargoyle on top of another tent. There was a couple with a baby in that one, and I began to sweat. Again, like magic, it just disappeared. And I looked everywhere and couldn't find this thing. I headed over to my tent, and as I got to the mouth of my tent, the shadow appeared right in front of my face. I could make out a head with some features on it, but it was just more of a shadow. I could see that it tried to smile at me before jumping high into the air through the branches, and the leaves were just like raining on me until it was out of sight. I barely got any sleep that night, and I never have been camping since. The United States has a total of 63 national parks. Over 300 million people visit these national parks every single year. But with such a flood of visitors, there needs to be a safety net. Thus, the National Park Service was created. It was created in 1916 by the U.S. Congress, and its job is not only to protect the park, but also the visitors. Now, almost 600,000 people go missing every single year in the United States, and many of these cases take place in the wilderness. With our national parks comprised of several million acres of land, most of it tough terrain to navigate for even the most experienced, it's no surprise that there have been some dangerous outcomes when people submerge themselves in the wilds of our parks. Hiking in Yellowstone is one of the most loved pastimes of visitors of the park. They have the option to tag along with a ranger, or go on a day hike, or take on a longer, more arduous trails that truly leave hikers alone in the wilderness. While trails are marked for difficulty level and length, not everyone pays attention to these guidelines. A shocking number of hikers tackle the trails unprepared for inclement weather, injuries, or unexpected overnight stays. Is this the reason that several people have gone missing within the Yellowstone borders? If they simply stepped off the path for a moment, wouldn't their remains have been found by others passing the same way? After all, 3 million visitors a year are bound to cover a fair amount of acreage in this national park. Surprisingly, between 2018 and 2020, there were only 371 reported search and rescue cases in Yellowstone National Park. That's not many considering how many visitors get to the park annually. Unfortunately, some people don't make it out of Yellowstone alive, but even stranger, a handful have never been found. As of today, there are 4 individuals who have disappeared in Yellowstone without a trace. The circumstances of their stories and situations vary, but one fact remains: no one knows what happened to them. Dan Campbell may be by far the most interesting case of a person going missing in Yellowstone National Park. Not only did his disappearance draw a lot of attention from the media, but this case remains in the public eye thanks to his family's insistence that the Park Service handled everything completely wrong. Campbell was 41 years old when he began his hike in the hell-roaring trailhead region of the park on April 4, 1991 with his dog, an Australian Shepherd. Campbell was known to pack light, and it became known that he was out on the park looking for elk antlers. Gathering antlers and selling them is an illegal but not uncommon practice on public land. Campbell's older brother, Bill, stated that he had been running with some pretty shady characters. In an effort to get enough money to move to White Sulphur Springs, collecting and selling antlers was part of these efforts. Campbell's girlfriend, Tracy Erb, was supposed to meet him in the Jardine area just outside the park on April 6th. She was to pick him up and bring him home. When she didn't show, Tracy reported him missing on April 8th. It should be noted that the hike from Hell-Roaring Creek Trail to Jardine is a long one. Some experienced hikers have said that it would have been tough to complete the hike in just 2 days. Unfortunately for Campbell, another factor was likely slowing him down. Shortly after his set out on his hike on April 4th, winter weather was documented in the park. A spring snowstorm came through and unexpectedly covered the area in snow. If Campbell had packed light and wasn't anticipating cold weather, there's a chance that he became a victim to hypothermia. But Campbell's family has other suspicions, ones that they claim the Park Service didn't look into in a professional manner. Searchers spent weeks in the air and on the ground looking for a sign of Campbell. Due to distrust in the investigation, Bill Campbell dug into his brother's disappearance on his own and discovered that at the time there were at least 14 other individuals in the area looking for antlers. One of them had heard 2 gunshots. Shortly after Dan's disappearance, his family became vocal about their dissatisfaction with the investigation. His younger brother Rod was quoted saying, "If Dan's in the park, he's buried." In 2000, 9 years after his disappearance, Campbell's 3 brothers, Bill, Jerry, and Rod, decided to sue former Park County Sheriff Charlie Johnson. The brothers claimed that Charlie botched the investigation of what could have been Dan Campbell's murder. In response, park officials came out and said that Dan Campbell's case was always treated as a disappearance and not a homicide, insinuating that they had no reason to believe that he may have been murdered. But his brothers uphold that during the investigation. Information came out that pointed toward a more sinister ending for Dan Campbell. Charlie Johnson didn't bother following that line of possibility. The lawsuit, filed on January 10th of 2000, stated that Johnson breached his legal duty to properly and competently conduct the investigation related to the disappearance of Dan Campbell. Aside from the other 14 hunters in the area, most of whom weren't tracked down and questioned, and the gunshots heard, the Montana Criminal Investigation Bureau was also involved at some point according to the paperwork. The Bureau doesn't normally investigate missing persons, so it makes sense that the Campbell family is suspicious of their involvement. Could the park staff have been considering other possibilities for Dan's disappearance and not made their concerns public? Additionally, during the investigation, Johnson's deputies did interview 2 other antler hunters. Not that impressive considering there were 12 more in the area at that time. The hunters were camping outside of the park's northern boundaries, and park staff seized their equipment. Instead of analyzing the gear appropriately using fingerprinting, fiber analysis, and other modes of testing to figure out if they had run into Campbell at all, Johnson simply returned the gear, which included ammo, spent cartridges, and supposedly a firearm. This is where Dan's brothers are sure that Johnson didn't make a true effort. With so many other hunters in the area, many of whom likely had guns, and a competitive illegal practice taking place, in their eyes it's just as possible that their brother was murdered as he became lost in winter weather, especially if there has been no body or sign of Dan Campbell found. It's been speculated that Campbell disappeared on purpose, but his family denies that as a possibility. He was due to collect a significant legal settlement in a court case, so why would he have skipped out on that windfall? Campbell's family believes it is much more likely that he ran into other hunters who killed him out of competition and hid his body within the park. They also believe that the Park Service knows this was a possibility but botched the investigation, meaning they will likely never know what really happened to Dan. Yellowstone National Park and park officials have stood by Johnson, openly declaring that the case is and always has been considered a disappearance. Still, it doesn't look good for Johnson. He was eventually investigated for misuse of authority and sexual assault, with a cash settlement paid to the woman accusing him. And later, an uprising in the Park Service resulted in all but one of Johnson's deputies signing a document publicly endorsing his challenger, who eventually beat him in the 1998 election. Whatever went on in the investigation, whether botched or not, it doesn't look like we will be finding out what truly happened to Dan Campbell during his hunting trip. Bruce Pike was last seen on August 2, 2006, at the campground on Indian Creek. Indian Creek Campground is located near the northern border of the park, just off of 89 and south of Mammoth Hot Springs. Hiking trails as well as great fishing spots are easily accessible from the campground. The National Park Service notes that there's no cell service at the site, and it's also located in bear country. Beyond the very basic information, there's not much known about Pike. At the time he disappeared, he was 47. He had brown hair, brown eyes, and often wore glasses. The National Park Service has him listed as lost or injured missing. Oddly, absolutely no one knows what Pike was up to in Yellowstone. Several hiking trails are accessible from Indian Creek, including the Bighorn Pass Trail, a 19.2-mile point-to-point trail considered to be moderately challenging to hikers. Elk and moose are sighted on the trail regularly. Is it possible that Pike was there to hike one of the trails out of Indian Creek? What are the chances he was attacked by a wild animal in the backcountry, but somehow went completely unseen on some of the more popular well-traveled trails? Pike's vehicle would eventually be found abandoned in the park, which prompted the initial search for him, but it doesn't appear that he had any family or friends looking for him. There's not a trail of media attention on his disappearance, at least nothing that is easy to find. Even the National Park Cold Case database lacks the answers to some pretty straightforward questions. Where was he from? Did he appear to have any camping or hiking gear in his car? Had anyone else at the campsite seen him that day? When Pike set foot in the park in 2006, he would leave behind more questions than answers, and no clue as to what his plans were. On September 6, 2010, Stuart Isaac left a note for his family at home in Burtonsville, Maryland. In it, he wrote he was embarking on a cross-country trip. He ended up driving approximately 32 hours to Yellowstone National Park. Stewart's black 2009 Lexus sedan would later be found abandoned at Craig Pass during a routine patrol of the area by park staff. This was 20 days after he left home on September 26th. Park Service employees found that the car was unlocked and still had keys inside. They began a search immediately. It's reported that Isaac had no hiking or camping experience. The area where his car was found is 8 miles east of Old Faithful on the Grand Loop Road. There were no hiking trails in this area at the time, so it's unlikely that he was planning on hiking that day. But what would have gotten Isaac out of his car, and did he plan to return to it quickly, having left his keys there? Despite ground and air searches, Stuart Isaac has never been found. IDing his body would have been relatively easy, as he has tattoos on both shoulder blades and his right tricep. But there was literally nothing for the searchers to discover, nor has there been to this day. Why did he decide to head to Yellowstone that day in September? And what caused his disappearance? A hike that went wrong? Suicide? Or something more sinister? The one clue that searchers, friends, and family members have is a call that he made 2 days before his arrival in the park. On September 24th, Isaac had called a friend in Guam, Matsu Evans. Matsu thought the call was strange, and Isaac usually preferred text or email for communication. Isaac told Matsu he was en route to Yellowstone, and they spoke for 2 hours at the time of the call. It was 3:30 a.m. in Maryland. Matsu is quoted having said, "I was surprised to hear from him because he seldom made calls. We text each other and we do email. Now that I know he's missing, why would he call me 2 days just before something happened?" It's a good question. This phone call to Guam is the last known communication that Isaac made. He never reached out to his family again, so it's impossible to know what his plans were. Unfortunately, there was very little coverage of this missing persons case, and his family doesn't seem to have spoken out about the odd circumstances. A quickly jotted note, an unlikely cross-country trip for an inexperienced hiker in an empty car. Kim Crumbo has been described by family and friends and colleagues as a legend, and his track record definitely supports that statement. Crumbo gained notoriety as a part of the Navy SEAL team, earning a Presidential Unit Citation for extraordinary heroism in Vietnam with SEAL Team 1. He was also awarded a Bronze Star for personal acts of heroism. Crumbo also ended up finding work as a park ranger and a river guide. To say that he was familiar with the outdoors and wild areas would be an understatement. Several of his colleagues have remarked that Crumbo was the man to have with you out in the wild. His experience and love for nature made him capable and competent. At the time of his disappearance, Kim Crumbo was 74 and working as a board member and a wildlands coordinator for the Rewilding Institute, a conservation nonprofit. He also served on the boards of several other conservancy groups and councils, pursuing his love of the wilderness by protecting it at all costs. In September 2021, Kim and his half-brother Mark O'Neill, who also retired from the Park Service, embarked on a 4-night excursion into Yellowstone. The brothers headed for the Shoshone Lake located near the western border of the park. As Yellowstone's second largest lake, it is truly massive, a shocking 8,000 acres of water and shoreline. Relatives reported the men missing on September 19th, when they failed to return from their trip. That same day, searchers found an empty campsite on the south side of the lake. On September 20th, Mark O'Neill was found deceased on the east side of the lake, having washed up on shore. A canoe, paddle, personal flotation device, and other various items were found nearby. An autopsy performed on Mark would eventually reveal that he died of exposure and more specifically hypothermia. But the search for Kim Crumbo continued. Teams moved by foot with the assistance of search dogs. They walked trails in the area and scoured the shore of Shoshone Lake while also using helicopters to search the water in a grid pattern. But a week after the search began, and partly due to the discovery of Mark O'Neill's fate, the status changed from a rescue to a recovery. Yellowstone's Submerged Resources Center began to use sonar equipment to search the lake depths, in the hopes of returning Kim to his family. However, nothing was found. In early October, as the weather changed with the approach of winter, Yellowstone National Park officials decided to officially scale back the search. This was the last formal declaration by the park regarding Kim Crumbo's disappearance. Crumbo's wife has stated that volunteers continue to work unofficially, walking the shores of the lake. She believes that her husband also perished in a surprise storm that likely overtook the lake, which can appear tranquil but can quickly change into a dangerous situation. According to the National Park Service, the lake regularly experiences high winds and the average water temperature in the area is 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Perfect conditions for a boat to go over and victims to suffer hypothermia. Survival time in these conditions is estimated by the National Park Service to be around 20 to 30 minutes tops. While in the area during the early days of the search, Crumbo's wife experienced this quick change in conditions firsthand. She stated that although some friends and colleagues still reach out hoping that Kim is alive, she is sure that he passed in the same storm that took his brother's life. In 2020, Holly Cordier, a California mother and self-described as a free spirit, entered the Zion National Park in Utah without her phone and without telling anyone where she was going. Holly was missing for 12 days, lost in the park. During the search for Holly, her family had been asking for online tips, sightings, or any other information that would lead to Holly's return. When she was finally located, nearly 2 weeks after entering the park, with nothing but some clothing, boots, and a hammock. Before she had gone to the park, her family cited odd behavior. She was unusually emotional and said goodbye to her loved ones as if she would not see them for a long time. The search finally concluded after 12 days of Holly having been lost in the park. She returned nearly starving, suffering from injuries, kidney failure, and a concussion. She was then rushed to receive medical care. While this should have been the end of the story, it was only the beginning. Due to a sheriff making a comment about Holly's story not adding up, the family began receiving hate mail, death threats, and accusations that their fundraiser was a hoax. The family eventually needed to close their social media accounts and get new phone numbers. Holly's sister Jamie came out to explain how the backlash had negatively affected their family. They had just wanted help finding their beloved Holly, and were now facing nothing but adversity and hate. After her return, Holly said that she had been looking for a true retreat, to be alone and to connect with nature, and to read her Bible. She was looking for a full disconnect and spiritual journey, and ended up fighting for her life. Apparently, she had exhausted herself on her first day, and later hit her head. Holly herself guessed that she was able to survive because she fasted regularly. While concussed and delirious, she had been wetting her mouth with water from a nearby river, which was contaminated with bacteria. She had even seen some people searching, presumably for her, but she couldn't yell due to extreme dehydration. Finally, Holly was found and is said to have survived only because she had found a water source and enough wherewithal not to drink the river water. The story had a happy-ish ending, but still remains an oddity, specifically due to Holly being able to survive so long without drinking water, and to the treatment the family received during the search, and especially after Holly was found. The GoFundMe set up by Holly's family raised over $12,000 and saw extreme backlash the second that Holly's story was questioned, despite her terrible physical condition upon discovery. Some of the controversy may have come from statements made about her actual rescue. There are mixed reports, with some people reporting she could barely walk. Others stated she was found sound of mind and body and walked out of the park on her own capabilities. And others cite that she was in a terrible condition and transported directly to the hospital emergency room, where she was treated for many injuries, including kidney trouble, dehydration, and exhaustion. Those who heard conflicting information began hatching conspiracy theories and accusing the family of foul play, just to invent a GoFundMe with no backing. The conspiracy got so large that a Facebook group was created for people to discuss what actually happened to Holly. The family stands by their efforts and say that the national attention is the only reason Holly has been found and subsequently survived. Paula Weldon was, as far as her family and friends have said about her, a regular college student. She went to Bennington University, living on campus during the school year. She was interested in the arts, music, and botany. Her classmates would describe her as a typical young woman. However, in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Weldon seemed depressed and had not returned home for Thanksgiving that year. According to her roommate at the time, on December 1st, 1946, Paula decided she wanted a break from studying and decided to go for a long walk in Bennington State Park. This is on the Vermont Long Trail. Paula hitchhiked to her destination around 2:45 p.m. It was said that she was not wearing weather-appropriate clothing for December in Vermont. At 4 p.m., Paula spoke with a witness, Ernest Whitman, on the trail, asking for its total distance. This is the last time anyone ever saw Paula or heard from her again. Paula was the second person to go missing on this trail between 1945 and 1950. Some have deemed this spot as the Bennington Triangle and believe there is a Bigfoot or werewolf-like creature in these woods. History dating as far back as Native Americans on this part of land describe it as being cursed and filled with wild, hairy men. Throughout the years, there have been other strange sightings near this trail, including UFOs and unexplained lights. The Monday following, when Paula did not show up to classes, the school contacted Paula's father. It is unknown why Paula's roommate did not come forward over the weekend as to her roommate's absence. However, because there were no protocols set in place for this situation, there was no official search at the time of her disappearance. On December 5th, finally, the search began. Locals, students, and even Boy Scouts all searched the long Vermont Trail, and a destination that Paula had been remembered as wanting to visit, Everett Cave on Mount Anthony. There was also a local cab driver who picked up a young woman headed to the bus station on December 1st, but could not say for sure if it was Paula. Authorities followed up at the bus station, and staff was unable to say for sure if Paula had come through that night. Both the cab driver and the bus station staff apologized and explained having busy nights, and were not able to remember if it was actually Paula that they had seen. If Paula had gotten on a bus, she could have ended up anywhere. There have been many theories and speculations about what happened to Paula, but the fact remains that the last place she was seen was on the trail. No one has ever been able to definitively place Paula anywhere after Ernest Whitman at 4 p.m. on December 1st. The state of Vermont has responded to this incident by creating a team of authorities who would search for the missing people in the trails, parks, and mountains in the local area. Alfred, just 4 years old, was one of the first to disappear in the Rocky Mountain National Park. He was visiting the park over the 4th of July weekend in 1938. He was last seen with his father swimming in the river nearby their campsite in the park. He had reportedly gone a bit downriver to a family friend's campsite. When the group was on their way back to camp, Alfred fell behind. When they all reconvened, Alfred was missing. A search began immediately, but Alfred was never seen again. Some unconfirmed sightings of Alfred, including a boy matching his description, was seen walking down the said trail with a man holding hands. The search lasted 10 days, and at its most robust had over 150 people searching. By the 10th day, the search had reduced just to a dozen people. Alfred was never seen again, and park rangers ultimately recorded his disappearance as a drowning incident. After 5 months, the family received a ransom note requesting $500 for Alfred's return. The police investigated and found that it was not a real ransom note. Alfred's father gave up hope and was said to believe that his son was abducted, not having drowned. In 1966, 6-year-old Larry Jeffrey, along with his stepbrothers, were hiking on Mount Charleston in Humboldt National Forest. This is just outside of Las Vegas, Nevada. When the siblings reached the peak, they noticed their 6-year-old Larry was not with them and must have wandered away. Due to the extreme danger a 6-year-old would be facing, stranded on a mountaintop, the National Guard and bloodhounds were soon searching the mountain. Up to 1,000 people had been searching at the height of the emergency, but even after 16 days of searching, not a trace of the boy was found. Searchers reported finding evidence that Larry had been foraging in the wilderness, but the trail continuously went cold at random intervals. It was never suspected that Larry had been abducted, since no one else was seemingly on the mountain at that time. And obviously, an abduction by a car would not have been possible. One authority figure involved in the search noted to the media that the boy walked into oblivion. Mitchell was visiting Mesa National Park in Colorado with his family in the summer of 2013. He was accompanied by his wife, his parents, at this park. On Sunday, June 9th, Mitchell went for a hike, citing a location less than a mile away. His parents and wife were not physically able to make the hike with him, but Mitchell, who often went by his middle name Dale, was an experienced hiker, and his family was not worried. This would be the last time the family ever saw Dale alive. He had been on his way to see an ancient and breathtaking historic site of the Spruce Tree Cliff Lookout. This area is significant, infamous for the Basket Maker Society in about 1000 BC. This ancient civilization remained in this area, as history changed the name of the people as time went on. These people were infamous for their practices of human sacrifice. Dale's wife described her husband as not having a great sense of direction, and that he had set out without supplies or water. It is possible that he had accidentally gone down the wrong trail. Connected to the trail that he was following was another, more dangerous trail, the Petroglyph Point Trail, home to drop-offs and steep inclines. Anyone in the summer heat without water or a map could potentially make this mistake. A search with bloodhounds was conducted to no avail. It is assumed that Dale had wandered off the trail accidentally. Because his destination was close by, the family reported him missing as soon as they realized he should have come back. Park rangers searched the trail and the site he had been traveling to and found nothing. They asked the family to wait in case Dale had gone down a different trail. When several more hours passed, the family informed the park rangers that he had not returned. But they said he had not been in distress nor asked for help. He was not located and they didn't find any remains until 2020, by the way of an anonymous tip. His remains were located only a few miles away from where he started. This story remains popular since there is so little information in the suspicious nature of his disappearance. To this day, no one knows what happened to him, but the autopsy performed did show signs of foul play. In 1971, Douglas Legg was a young boy of 8 years old, whose family owned a cabin on the Adirondack Forest Preserve. While on a hike, Douglas's uncle noticed poison ivy and asked the boy to return home to put on long pants. They were not far from the cabin, and Douglas's family called him a mini woodsman due to his outdoorsy tendencies, and he was reported to have known the woods he was in very well. However, the boy did not make it home for a clothing change. The last anyone saw of him was a cousin and a brother who saw him on his way back to the cabin, but no one has seen him since. Douglas's mother was related to the family that had originally established the Santanoni Estate residential area, where the family's cabin was located. The cabin had been in Douglas's family for generations, and he had basically grown up in those woods during family summer vacations. The half-mile way from the trail back to the house was nothing for this boy in such an outdoorsy family, who had grown up learning about the outdoors, how to safely hike in the woods, and had a keen sense of direction. This disappearance sparked an enormous and thorough search, with up to 600 people searching the woods at the time. Nearby Newcomb Lake was searched, with no sign of the boy having drowned. Bloodhounds were used in this search, and they caught Douglas's scent and dragged handlers over 30 miles through very rough terrain. Handlers and authorities were doubtful that a boy so young could have made it all that way. Not to mention, he was not found by the dogs. It was speculated that perhaps a bear had gotten him and dragged him, but bears are not known to do so for upwards of 30 miles. During the height of the search, the United States Air Force was involved, using heat detecting techniques, and helicopters began searching from the skies. As the search continued, cold weather started to set in, and volunteers and authorities began to search for a body. At one point, another bloodhound caught Douglas's scent again, but it led to a pond. The pond was dragged and searched like the lake. As the search went on and on, the family began to descend into paranoia along with extreme grief. Some of them started accusing each other of foul play. Although none of these accusations ever went anywhere, after 6 weeks the search was called off. Douglas simply vanished without a trace. Since his disappearance, some tips have come through. Once, a mentally ill woman called the police to tell them that a member of her family was responsible for Douglas's death, and that they had dumped his body. This tip was proven false. Another tip came in when a hiker believed that he had stumbled upon human remains. Again, this tip was proven false after they were not consistent with the state of the boy's remains would have been in after so much time had passed. To this day, no one knows what happened to this poor young boy. Matt Thoke, who was 43, went missing in July of 2021 on a hike at Sequoia National Park in California. He had been hiking with a group and separated from them during a multi-day hiking trip. Apparently, Thoke wanted to hike nearby Crescent Meadow, but wished to go alone. Thoke was not seen after he parted ways with his group and set off on his own. He left his backpack behind, and when he didn't come back for it, his group reported him missing. A search and rescue effort was made by the park rangers, local authorities, and search and rescue teams, with dogs and helicopters from the skies. Thoke's body would be found a month later in a spot that was not visible by ground or sky. Thoke is survived by his wife Lisa, who had been hopeful that her husband would have been found in time. Although his body was found in a strange place, it was not too far from where he had disappeared. His body was found in a very technical part of the trail. Alaska became the 49th state in the United States in 1959, but exploration of this cold northern region began long before that date. Native Alaskans first set foot on the continent roughly 15,000 years ago, with permanent settlements appearing 4,000 years ago. When the 1700s arrived, explorers came from all corners of the world. These days, Alaska is known for its stunning national parks, glaciers, the northern lights, and many other natural features. Each year, over 2 million tourists visit Alaska, which has a total population of just over 700,000 people. While some visitors decide to stay and become locals, that number is pretty low. Alaska is a harsh but beautiful place. It takes a certain kind of fortitude and respect for nature to live there, day in and day out. According to the Alaska Department of Public Safety, about 1 in every 250 people go missing every year. It's not hard to do in a state which is the largest in the United States in terms of square mileage. The number of missing persons is double the national average, but it's highly concentrated in one area of the state, the Alaska Triangle. You've likely heard of the Bermuda Triangle, and are wondering why you've never heard of a parallel in the northernmost territory of the United States. Surprisingly, they both gained notoriety around the same time, with the first reported suspicious disappearances taking place in the 1950s. But the Alaska Triangle gained national attention in October 1972. But before we dig into the details of that sordid story, let's take a look at where exactly the triangle falls. The Alaska Triangle spans a large portion of the state's eastern region, from Utqiagvik down to Anchorage in the south, and then over to Yakutat and Juneau in the southeast. It also covers a small sliver of Canada's Yukon Territory. What draws people to Alaska is often the same thing that is their undoing: the vast, untouched wilderness. The region marked as the Alaska Triangle is full of beautiful and hazardous landscapes, glaciers, crevasses, tundra, and forests. Since 1988, over 16,000 people have gone missing in the Alaska Triangle, or perhaps vanished is a better word, as no personal belongings, trails, or wreckage are ever found. National recognition of strange happenings in this slice of the state began in October 1972, when 4 men were traveling from Anchorage to Juneau by private plane. The plane, a Cessna 310C, was flown by Don Johns, a bush pilot. On it were U.S. House Majority Leader Hale Boggs, Alaska Congressman Nick Begich, and Russell Brown, an aide. Sometime during the 850-mile trip, without explanation, the plane and the 4 men disappeared completely. Over the course of the next 39 days, both civilians and military would get involved trying to track down the missing men. The search spanned roughly 32,000 square miles and involved 40 military aircrafts and 50 civilian planes, plus countless of boats. But no trace was ever found, not of the men or the plane. This can't exactly be chalked up to incompetence, as Don Johns was not only a skilled pilot who owned not only a Cessna he flew that day, but a small charter company as well. Johns, more than anyone, would have recognized any danger in the air, whether it was the change in weather patterns or if it was running too close to a ridge, and he could have responded appropriately. At the time of this infamous disappearance, emergency locator transmitters were not required in U.S. aircrafts. The silver lining here is that the tragedy pushed Congress to pass a law mandating that all U.S. civilian aircrafts have these devices installed. Today, emergency locator transmitters are used to transmit a plane or crew's GPS position for search and rescue. In the years that followed the disappearance of Boggs, Begich, Brown, and Johns, there would be more plane crashes, plus missing hikers, boaters, and hunters, all gone without a trace. Tourists and locals alike fall prey to the Alaska Triangle, which means that the knowledge of the area and the bushcraft won't necessarily save you if you happen to wander in the invisible borders of this legendary region. Let's take a look at some of the more notorious disappearances that have taken place in the Alaska Triangle. Despite the draw of attention in 1972, this wasn't the first or the last missing aircraft in the Alaska Triangle. In 1950, a Douglas C-54D Skymaster disappeared within the triangle's boundaries as it flew towards Montana. There were 44 people on board. The aircraft made its last radio contact 2 hours into the 8-hour flight. When the plane didn't arrive in Montana, a search and rescue program called Operation Mike was launched. 85 American and Canadian planes and 7,000 personnel searched an area of 350,000 square miles for the missing plane. What makes this an especially odd disappearance are the sights and sounds reported by searchers and those nearby. Several individuals claimed to have seen smoke signals, heard garbled communication over the radio, and glimpsed sightings of survivors. None of these claims ever led to anything being found, not a body, a scrap of clothing, or pieces of the downed aircraft. 2 planes and 2 radio stations in the Yukon area also claimed to have heard radio signals that they were unable to understand or fix to an exact location. An isolated settler in the area reported seeing a large plane flying over his cabin, but nothing was ever found in that area. Just shy of a month later, the search was officially canceled, and the next of kin were notified that the 44 members were presumed dead. Frank Minano was 69 when he went missing from Nenana, a former railroad construction camp, in August of 2020. Nenana is located roughly 60 miles to the west of Fairbanks, and it sits practically in the center of the Alaska Triangle. Minano was described by NBC 11 as a traditional educator and mentor on culture, hunting, subsistence living, and respecting the land. If this was true, it's hard to believe that Minano could have just disappeared into the woods, which is what authorities initially believed. They supposedly found some signs that he took shelter in a cabin the first night that he went missing, but nothing, no belongings or trail, was found beyond that. As of today, there's been no sign of Minano. His family continues to believe he is missing, but in truth, he seems to have simply vanished into the wilderness. Thomas Newsy was reported missing on June 19, 2001. At the time, Newsy was a nurse who traveled throughout Alaska. He had no permanent address and stayed at hotels depending on where he was employed. The night before he went missing, authorities discovered gas station surveillance footage of Newsy in Anchorage, a short flight away from where he was working. In the video, he is accompanied by a woman and purchases cigarettes. When investigators questioned employees at the motel he was staying at, housekeepers revealed that they came upon a strange man and woman in Newsy's room, but apparently didn't feel the need to report it. His bicycle was later found at a nearby storage unit, and his Jeep was found 12 miles outside of Anchorage. No sign of Newsy or the strangers in his room were ever found. His disappearance is a dead end, but it took place in the boundaries of the Alaska Triangle, and brings up a main concern of those interested in the various vanishings that have spanned decades. While it's not entirely uncommon for planes to go missing in Alaska and later to be found crashed upon a mountainside or swallowed by a crevasse, what's more surprising is the disappearance of individuals going about their day-to-day life. This seems to be the case for a number of the 16,000 people who have gone missing in the Alaska Triangle. Like Newsy, some have simply disappeared into thin air, walking home after a party, or even just going out to their car. They leave behind their belongings, purses, wallets, phones, so robbery doesn't seem to be involved. While murder might be an option, it's unlikely that so many have been committed with absolutely no evidence. So what else do people think might be causing these disappearances? There are truly 1,000 ways to die in Alaska. The danger of the landscape is often overlooked for its beauty, but locals will tell you that beauty can draw you to your death in a place like the Alaska Triangle. Filled with lakes, glaciers, mountain ranges, and vast tundra, the Triangle is a perfect combination of elements and landscape to present challenges to even the most well-trained bushmen. The glaciers, for example, are not as solid as they appear. Glaciers have sort of a honeycomb makeup with hidden chambers and deep crevasses, sometimes larger than an office building, that could easily hide an entire plane. On the other hand, the dense forest that fills the Triangle are home to a variety of deadly wildlife. Alaska is bear country, well known for dangerous grizzly encounters. As of today, there's 50,000 grizzlies that reside in the United States, and 30,000 of them are in Alaska. The state is known for having the most bear attacks per year, with bear and human interactions both frequent and fatal. Other predators living off the land include wolves, black bears, lynx, and wolverines. The controversial mountain lion has also been sighted through many regions of the state. Add the danger of coming across herbivores like the moose, and it's easy to see how one wrong step could lead to a violent and bloody death. And if the wildlife doesn't get you, the weather will. The lowest temperature ever recorded in Alaska was negative 79.8 degrees Fahrenheit in January of 1971, a U.S. record. Average annual temps come in just under 10 degrees Fahrenheit. For those unprepared for such conditions, a lack of preparation can easily and quickly become deadly. Hypothermia, caused by prolonged exposure to cold temperatures, slowly leads to the body shutting down and is not an uncommon fatality. Each year, about 25,000 people die of hypothermia in the United States. Another 8,000 per year occur in Canada. Perhaps a good number of those who go missing in the Alaska Triangle simply suffer from a lack of preparation and slowly give in to the unforgiving landscape that is Alaska. Many people argue that Alaska has more than enough to get rid of a person with little effort. Across the state, there are 17 of the nation's tallest mountains, 2 of the nation's largest forests, totaling over 20 million acres combined, over 100 volcanoes and volcanic fields, over 3 million lakes, and seemingly endless coastline. But even the original people of Alaska, the Tlingit, suspect that something more is going on. It's not a place that you go to if you're inexperienced. So what has been taking so many people every single year without a sign of their misfortune? The Tlingit people of Alaska are indigenous to the area. In both Yukon and Alaska, they have a combined population of 16,000 people. An interesting coincidence when it comes to the triangle. The Tlingit have an interesting legend that resonates with current-day Bigfoot believers. Their creature, however, is called Kushtaka, or Land Otter Man. The Kushtaka are said to be shapeshifters who have appearance of men but have evil intent. They work to trap a victim's soul and keep them from reincarnating in our world. According to the legend, a person or small group can be approached anywhere at any time, whether they're in a town or village or hunting or fishing, by a man or a group of men. These men look no different from you or I. They may appear friendly and can often show up when help is most needed. For example, if a hiker is injured or hunter lost. Offering help or simply a friendly conversation, the Kushtaka will lure a person deeper into the wilderness. It's in these wild surroundings that they'll trap their victim's soul, and then the individual will never be seen again. In some reports, Kushtaka will also call out as a group, sounding like women or children in distress. There is one thing that the Kushtaka stay away from: dogs. Luckily, Alaska has countless dogs, and while it's said that this legend is used to keep children from wandering too far from home, adults and visitors to the States may want to take it to heart and remember to stay close to safety. Of course, there are other creatures that could be taking advantage of Alaska's wild expanse, including the notorious Bigfoot, on which science seems to be divided. No matter what's out there, it seems that stepping foot, even just briefly, toward a stranger in the shadows of your village or just off the trail into the wilderness could be the last thing you ever do. One of the most commonly discussed explanations is that of energy vortexes. An energy vortex is an area where concentrated energy forms a spiral, creating both positive and negative effects. These effects can be physical, mental, or emotional. Symptoms are said to include disorientation, confusion, hallucination, nightmares, and more. All have been reported by hikers, hunters, locals, and tourists in the area, as well as those who experience strange events in the Bermuda Triangle. If negative energy vortexes truly cover large portions of the Alaska Triangle, it wouldn't be surprising that someone who wandered across the state could quickly become disoriented. And if such effects are possibly caused by a completely invisible force, what else might we be ignorant of? While there's still a fair amount of skepticism on the topic of energy vortexes, there's been some support on the topic as well. Scientists and engineers taking electronic readings across the state have found magnetic anomalies, sometimes strong enough to pull a compass off track. With science backing at least the basics of this theory, it looks like it's a very real possibility. The triangle encompasses a huge amount of wilderness and could house countless vortexes for people to stumble upon. With even the United States government owning up to sighting quite a few of unidentified flying objects over the last decades, it's getting harder and harder to argue that we might not be totally alone. Aliens may be a valid reason behind the myriad of odd happenings, including disappearances. Stories of aliens kidnapping humans aren't new, but perhaps these distant visitors have found a preferred place of exploration in the Alaska Triangle. In 1986, a report made to the Federal Aviation Administration by a Japanese cargo flight appears to have referenced an extraterrestrial sighting. Japanese Airlines Flight 1628 encountered 3 unidentified aerial manifestations while en route to their destination. The pilot initially thought they were military aircrafts and then wrote them off. But shortly after, he realized that the aircrafts were keeping a perfect pace with his jet and moving in an erratic way that shouldn't be possible. Over the course of 50 minutes, the aircrafts followed Flight 1628's path. Occasionally, the aircrafts would emit strange bursts of blinding light, making it hard to see. It would have been unsurprising for this report to get waved off, but civilian and military radar confirmed another presence in the skies that day with Flight 1628. If the pilot and crew of Flight 1628 were telling the truth, there may be a regular and comfortable alien presence within the boundaries of the Alaska Triangle. If there is, what are they doing there? Simply watching? Or are their intentions more nefarious? After all, humans out wandering the wilderness would be the perfect prey for aliens to snatch, easily written off as lost hikers or hunters attacked by wildlife. Alaska is a place of accidents. Why wouldn't extraterrestrials take advantage of that? But what makes the high number of disappearances in the Triangle most confusing is the mundane aspects of many lives cut short. While the disappearance of adventurous individuals can be explained away as an inevitable bullet that they were unable to dodge, how do people like Jael Hamblin, who vanished on their way home from dinner, disappear in plain sight? Hamblin is a perfect example of something that just feels plain wrong about the Alaska Triangle missing persons. On October 11, 2014, she went out to dinner with her roommate. The women made it back to their home, but Jael decided to go out by herself. The roommate woke the next morning to find Jael's car still in the driveway and her bed completely undisturbed. She clearly hadn't come home, but she didn't even make it out of the driveway. So how did Hamblin manage to go missing in the short walk from her front door to the car? Can it be explained away as a kidnapping or murder, or is there something more sinister going on in the Alaska Triangle? After all of the disappearances, very few logged any hint of what may have happened. No personal belongings found. No body discovered tucked away in the winter woods. No plane wreckage ever found. It seems that whatever is going on in the Alaska Triangle might be best explained by some of the so-called conspiracies, of which even the locals support. Accidents happen in Alaska. It's a place of deadly beauty. But something else may be lurking just beyond your front door, waiting to make you vanish into thin air. In the heart of West Virginia, surrounded by 600 acres of sweeping grounds and well-kept green lawns, a clock tower rises above a long Gothic-style building, which at first sight gives the impression of an expensive boarding school. This foreboding structure, once known as the Weston State Hospital, is the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, a former mental hospital with a dark history, and a place that is now widely regarded as one of the most haunted destinations in America. First opening its doors to patients in 1864, Trans-Allegheny was designed with rambling wings in a staggered structure in order to maximize sunlight and fresh air, as well as affording a degree of privacy to each of the patients. The idea was that the building itself would serve as a healing function for the people sent there. When it first opened, the hospital was indeed a great place for patients by the standards of the day. Its design and operation were models of progressive ideals, which sought to overturn people's misconceptions about mental health illness. It had long halls and 12-foot ceilings, plenty of windows and ventilation that allowed for a cross breeze. Each one of the original 250 patients was allowed their own room, and they were given the freedom to explore at their will. The grounds, which were self-sufficient, contained a working farm, waterworks, and a gas well. The original planners of the hospital believed that if patients were given some control over their lives, they would act better and perhaps even recover quicker. However, it was not long before the hospital would fall victim to the poor understanding and negative attitude of the society of the time towards mental health problems. In those days, people could be committed to the hospital for almost any reason, no matter how absurd or unreasonable. The first logbook of the hospital lists reasons for patient admission such as feebleness of intellect, seduction, novel reading, domestic trouble, and laziness. The hospital even offered money to people who dropped off a patient, leading to the admission of many people who showed no signs of mental illness when they were first committed. With so many people being brought in for such minor offenses against society, it wasn't long before the hospital was completely overrun with patients. The building, designed to hold 250 people, held 717 patients by 1880, and the numbers reached their peak in the 1950s when it held as many as 2,600 patients, over 10 times the capacity. With such rampant overcrowding, conditions in the hospital deteriorated considerably. Sanitation was low on the list of priorities for the under-resourced staff, who would often have to supervise as many as 250 patients each. Now keep in mind that a lot of facilities now require a 7-to-1 or 8-to-1 patient to staff ratio. So 250 patients per one staff is overwhelming to say the least. Troublesome patients were often locked in cages or chained to walls in solitary confinement, and violence inside the facility was rampant, particularly towards the women. The staff was hardly any safer than the patients. One evening, a nurse went missing, only for her rotting body to be found 2 months later at the bottom of a staircase that was no longer used. The hospital became known for its experimental medical practices, electroconvulsive shock therapy, ice water baths, seclusion cells, forced sterilization were all used, and a controversial form of lobotomy known as the ice pick method was performed on some 700 patients by a neurologist with no medical training known as Walter Freeman. This involved placing a slender rod into the corner of each eye socket, then striking it with a mallet to break through the eye socket in order to sever connective tissue in the brain. No anesthetic was used for this operation. Instead, patients were given electroshock treatment to induce a seizure and render them unconscious. Many previously healthy individuals were left with permanent cognitive and physical defects from this procedure, often needing around-the-clock care for their basic needs. Trans-Allegheny closed its doors in 1994 and has since been reopened as a museum, offering tours of the old facility. It is estimated that as many as 30,000 people have died within the walls of this hospital during its operation, many of whom are buried in unmarked graves on the hill overlooking the asylum. With such a terrible history, it is not surprising that the former Weston State Hospital has become a hotspot of paranormal activity, and many shadowy figures are reportedly seen at the hospital by staff and visitors on a regular basis. In a little room on Ward 4, balls have been known to roll across the ground on their own accord, and visitors to the room have frequently noted hearing a disembodied giggling voice. The voice is said to belong to Lily, a girl born in the asylum over 100 years ago, who died tragically of tuberculosis at the age of 9. On Ward 2, where many patients have committed suicide, and one man was stabbed to death by another patient, human figures are frequently seen walking the corridors, with voices sometimes being heard saying things like, "Get out." People who have been to these wards have reported feelings of anguish, grief, and even the feeling of suffocation when entering the rooms. On the 3rd floor, malevolent entities are said to walk the halls. Here, 2 patients named Joe and Big Jim attempted to hang a deaf and handicapped patient named Charlie, but when he refused to die easily, they brutally beat him to death. Doors open and close on this floor by themselves, and several people have reported being pushed and even scratched while visiting. The imposing facade of Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia may once have struck fear into the hearts of some of America's most violent and dangerous criminals. But for the modern visitor to this former prison, there is a different kind of dread to be found there. In its 142-year history, this prison became notorious for its brutal treatment of inmates, many of whom are said to roam its crumbling halls to this day. When it opened in 1829, the penitentiary was part of a new approach to reforming hardened criminals with the introduction of the solitary confinement method. This involved keeping prisoners in almost complete isolation from the moment they entered the prison. Whenever they went outside of their cells, prisoners were forced to wear a hooded mask with 2 slits to see through. They were permitted 1 hour of exercise per day, and the rest of the time they were confined to their cells with only a Bible to read. While serving their terms, prisoners had absolutely no contact with each other. The only human contact in their lives was with the warden, who would visit once a day, and overseers who would visit them 3 times a day. But even these interactions were conducted through small openings in their doors. Many who advocated these practices, known as the Pennsylvania system, believed that forcing prisoners to contemplate their misdemeanors in silence would eventually lead to rehabilitation. It was meant to be a substitute for the corporal punishments that were carried out in other prisons. In spite of this, torture turned out to be an all too common practice at the penitentiary. Water baths were used to drip prisoners in, after which they would be hung from a wall in freezing conditions until ice formed on their skin. The iron gag involved tying an inmate's hands behind the back with a chain trapped to an iron collar in the mouth, which caused the tongue to tear and bleed. Some prisoners were strapped to the mad chair so tightly that circulation would be cut off to certain parts of their body until the afflicted part would require amputation. Solitary confinement was also taken to the extreme, as prisoners could be thrown in the hole, an underground cell with no light, no toilet, and barely enough food or air, where they might have been left for months at a time. The prison is now a tourist attraction, but it's hardly surprising that such a terrible place is known for housing the troubled spirits of the many people who suffered and died within its walls. Footsteps, wailing voices, and screaming are all commonplace occurrences at Eastern State Penitentiary. Ghostly figures appear and disappear with regularity, and the silhouette of a guard is often seen in one of the watchtowers. Doors open and close randomly in the former prison, and one visitor even reported clearly hearing a voice saying, "I'm lonely," in an otherwise empty cell block. Perhaps the most alarming story, however, comes from a man who worked at Eastern State Penitentiary in the early 1990s. Gary Johnson was responsible for maintaining the locks in the decaying prison, and he had just entered cell block 4, an area of the prison where numerous people have mentioned hearing loud whispers and seeing anguished faces in the unused prison cells. Johnson was opening an old lock when, as he said, a massive force took hold of him, leaving him unable to move or speak. He then witnessed a kind of terrible negative energy explode out of the cell, with tormented faces appearing on the walls, some of which seemed to be beckoning him. Villisca is a small town in Iowa with fewer than 1,200 residents today, but in 1912 it was a lively railroad town with more than 2,500 residents. In the summer of that year, the town was the site of a grisly murder spree that has remained unsolved until this day. Josiah Moore had 4 children with his wife Sarah, who helped organize an annual event in the town called the Children's Day Program. On the evening of the event, 9-year-old Catherine Moore invited her friends, 12-year-old Lena Stillinger and her sister, 7-year-old Ina May, over for a sleepover. The following morning, neighbors noticed that the family had not come out to do their morning chores. One person attempted to enter the house but found that the door was locked from the inside. When 2 neighbors finally entered the house, what they found was shocking. The 6 members of the Moore family, as well as the 2 children visiting, had been murdered in the most brutal of fashions. As they lay in bed, someone had crept into their rooms and bludgeoned them to death while they slept, leaving unfortunate neighbors to find the bloody corpses in their beds the next day. The murder weapon was found in the guest bedroom by investigators, and all of the curtains in the house had been closed. The people of Villisca were convinced that no member of their community could have committed such a heinous crime, and a manhunt began for any outsider who might be still lurking in the town. Every transient in the town was a suspect, and several were tried but later released. Other suspects included Reverend George Kelly, a traveling minister known for his eccentric and sometimes perverted behavior. He was interrogated and even confessed to the murders later but recanted, and after 2 separate trials he was acquitted. Other investigators believed that the murders were part of a wide series of similar axe murders committed by 1 or more serial killers, which included the South Pacific Railroad killings of 1911 to 1912, the Axemen of New Orleans killings, and several cases in Kansas, none of which were ever solved, and all of them bore striking similarities to the Villisca murders. The Moore House in Villisca is now a historic landmark, but tourists who have gone there have reported some troubling incidents which suggest that the violence which occurred here has left an enduring legacy. Many people have spoken of seeing a shadowy figure with an axe standing at the end of the beds in the house, as well as some images of bloody shoes and sounds of children crying. One man who visited the house told of how he had been holding a knife in his hand when suddenly he felt an invisible grip on his wrist. The knife he was holding then turned around and stabbed him in the thumb. This may sound like a freak accident, but things like this have happened many times inside the Moore house. One incident involved a ghost hunter who had come to the house to investigate the reputation the place had for haunting and the supernatural phenomena. He had been alone in a room, as he put it. He had been acting aggressively, trying to provoke any supposed ghosts to come and get him if they dared. The next thing the man remembered was waking up in the emergency room hospital. He had been staying the night in the axe murder house with his elderly parents, who found him lying in a pool of blood in one of the rooms, with an enormous hunting knife protruding from his chest, which he later remembered he had been brandishing at the walls in the room. Not only did the ghost hunter in question give up on the ghost hunting after this event, but the caretaker of the house refused to sleep in it ever again, as he had seen and heard of many such disturbing encounters there.